"You're calling the fire department? On him? Lady, that man trained half our crew." That was the first thing I heard when I stepped onto the porch, drawn by flashing red lights and the unmistakable scent of smoked ribs still drifting through the backyard air. A fire truck was idling at the curb, its lights bouncing off the carefully trimmed hedges of our suburban neighborhood. A woman in a pastel jumpsuit, clenching her phone like a weapon, stood gesturing wildly toward my dad's smoker. She had no idea the man she just tried to report for reckless fire activity was none other than retired Fire Marshal Harold Simmons, the man who literally wrote the regional manual on grill safety. And if you thought that was the peak of her embarrassment, oh no. That was just the sizzling start. It had been a typical sunny Sunday morning. I stopped by my dad's place for lunch, as I often did, to catch up and see what he was cooking. As usual, he was already in grilling mode before I even rang the bell. The man's love for barbecue was borderline legendary, and since retiring from the fire department, he'd thrown himself into it like it was a second career. The backyard smelled like slow-cooked heaven. Smoke curled up gently from the smoker he had custom-built, a piece of equipment so safe and over-engineered it could probably survive a hurricane and still cook evenly. He was wearing his usual apron, the one that said "License to Grill," a gag gift from his department buddies that somehow felt more official than most uniforms. I was just settling in, lemonade in hand, when the wind shifted slightly, pushing the smoke over the fence into the yard next door. And that's when the neighborhood drama detonated. Enter Karen. You could always tell she was coming by the aggressive sound of her flip-flops and the smell of lemon-scented entitlement. She stormed through the side gate without knocking, tablet in hand and sunglasses so big they looked like a windshield. Her first words weren't even a greeting. "You're violating HOA Codes Section 12A and 15C, smoke emissions, flame height, and unauthorized use of open fire elements," she announced like she was auditioning for a courtroom reality show. Dad looked up from basting the ribs and blinked at her slowly. "Afternoon to you too, Karen. I didn't know the HOA had new codes on good cooking." She was not amused. "I'm serious. This entire grilling setup is a hazard. There are smoke plumes visible from the street. This is a family community. And those ribs are family approved," Dad replied with a straight face, not even pausing in his glaze application. "Also, the smoker's certified, up to code, and I have permits for all of it." That didn't stop her. She started taking photos of the grill, the yard, the house, probably trying to get a good angle for a dramatic post on the community app where she ruled like a budget dictator. My dad didn't even flinch. That man had handled 3 alarm fires, collapsed buildings, and once dragged a propane tank out of a burning kitchen. A woman waving an iPad was not about to throw him off. Karen, however, was not used to being ignored. With theatrical flourish, she dialed 911 and began spinning a tale so exaggerated it could have won her a daytime Emmy. "Yes, there's an elderly man operating a potentially dangerous grill setup. I smell gas. He's using multiple tanks. The smoke is thick and could cause respiratory issues." I watched in horror and disbelief as she paced back and forth, loudly detailing public endangerment and explosive risk, all while my dad calmly closed the smoker lid and turned to offer me a soda. "Want root beer or ginger ale?" he asked casually. About 15 minutes later, the fire truck arrived, sirens silent, but lights flashing. I expected maybe a junior officer to do a quick inspection. Instead, out stepped 3 full firefighters, all in casual gear, clearly responding more out of obligation than alarm. When the lead guy caught sight of my dad, he grinned wide and walked right up. "Marshal Simmons. What the heck, you grilling without inviting us again?" Dad laughed, gave him a quick handshake, and nodded toward the smoker. "Got ribs. Hickory wood. Ready in 20. Karen, still clutching her phone and now red-faced, looked like someone had slapped her with a salmon. "Wait, what?" she sputtered. "You know him?" The younger firefighter behind the lead nodded. "Yeah. He trained all of us. Pretty sure half the department still calls him boss. But I told the dispatcher, there's gas tanks and smoke and... The lead firefighter held up a hand, still chuckling. Ma'am, I promise you, this is the safest piece of backyard cooking equipment in the state. If anything, we're the ones who learned from him how not to burn the neighborhood down. I could see Karen's soul slowly leaving her body. Her mouth opened, then closed again like she was buffering. One of the other crew members, sensing the tension, leaned over and whispered something to the lead, who turned to Karen and said, "Also, next time, please don't misuse emergency services. That's actually a serious offense." That's when she snapped. Misuse? Are you kidding me? This is a safety hazard. That man had flames. I saw them. There was smoke everywhere. And it smelled delicious, said another firefighter, who'd already helped himself to a rib. Ma'am, you're welcome to lodge a formal complaint with the HOA, but as far as we're concerned, this is a textbook case of responsible grilling. Karen huffed, sputtered something unintelligible, and then stomped back to her house with all the grace of a raccoon in flip-flops. The firefighters stuck around for a few more minutes, mostly to taste-test the ribs and catch up with Dad. When they left, they jokingly asked him to please keep the smoke signals of excellence coming, and maybe next time to give them a heads-up so they could bring beer. As peace returned to the yard, Dad leaned back in his chair and said, "I give it 2 days before she tries something again." He was wrong. She didn't wait even that long. Because Karen wasn't the kind of person to take humiliation lightly. And what she did next would turn a neighborhood tiff into a full-blown HOA war. But as I looked at Dad, still as calm and unshaken as a mountain, I knew one thing for sure. Karen had absolutely no idea who she'd just picked a fight with. It would have made sense for most people to feel embarrassed after the stunt Karen pulled with the fire department. Most folks would have sheepishly avoided the person they just falsely accused and maybe quietly dropped the issue. But Karen wasn't most people. No, she was the kind who doubled down like she had a winning hand, even when her cards were clearly on fire. Less than 24 hours after the fire truck incident, Dad received an official-looking email from the HOA demanding his presence at an emergency violation hearing. The subject line alone was enough to make me laugh out loud. Urgent, unauthorized pyrotechnic activity and community endangerment, HOA disciplinary session. It sounded like someone was trying way too hard to sound important. But the kicker was the sender, Karen.hoa president@woodgrovemanors.net. My dad, cool as ever, read the email twice, sipped his coffee, and said, "Looks like I'm being summoned to the barbecue inquisition." I nearly choked on my toast. He wasn't worried, though. He'd been around long enough to know how to deal with puffed-up authority, and if anything, he found it amusing. But I could already tell Karen was about to turn a petty mistake into a neighborhood circus. When we arrived at the community clubhouse the next day, the place looked like it was prepped for a trial instead of a homeowner's chat. A long table had been set up at the front, complete with microphones and printed nameplates. Karen sat in the middle like some kind of suburban judge, flanked by 2 board members who looked more confused than confident. The only one who seemed enthusiastic was Frank, a greasy guy with a bad comb-over who'd always had a thing for rules no one else read. The room was filled with a mix of nosy neighbors and passive onlookers. Some had shown up with popcorn, literally. Someone in the back was munching on a bag and whispering commentary to the person beside them. It was obvious the whole neighborhood had heard about Karen's little 911 stunt and came to see what happened next. Karen tapped her microphone like she was starting a press conference. This meeting is to address a violation of Article 7, Clause 13, concerning flame-producing appliances used during peak fire risk conditions, she declared. Her voice echoed dramatically in the room. Dad smiled. "Just to clarify, is this about my smoker?" Karen ignored the question and launched into a speech about safety, property values, and the importance of uniformity in shared spaces. She even brought out a color-coded chart comparing air quality levels to the number of grills used per block. It looked like something she pulled off a sixth-grade science project site. When she finally paused to breathe, Dad stood up, pulled out a small folder, and calmly laid out certified documents from the county fire department. Permits, equipment inspection logs, a written statement from the fire chief confirming his grilling setup met and exceeded safety standard. I also brought a printout of the city's fire ordinance, which specifically exempts enclosed smokers from open flame restrictions, he said. Just in case we're pretending Google didn't exist. A few people in the room chuckled. Karen turned red. Frank tried to jump in, waving around a laminated HOA handbook, but Dad cut him off by casually saying, "Oh, Frank. You remember me, right? I was the one who cleared your fire pit permit back in 2018. Great little setup, though I did note your propane connection was a little shaky." Frank immediately leaned back, suddenly much quieter. Karen looked flustered but still refused to back down. "This isn't about permits or legalities. This is about community respect," she snapped. "And your grilling has become a nuisance." "Karen," my dad said evenly, "you called the fire department on the former fire marshal because of some wood smoke and brisket, then tried to call it pyrotechnic activity. You're not making a case, you're making a spectacle." For once, someone else on the board spoke up. It was Marcia, a soft-spoken older lady who'd mostly kept her head down. "Karen, I'm not sure this qualifies as a violation. I mean, we've all smelled the ribs. They're delightful." That was the moment the room turned. Laughter broke out in pockets. Someone yelled, "Best thing I've smelled in 10 years. Another added, "When's the next cookout?" Karen tried to regain control, banging her gavel so hard it bounced off the table and landed on the floor with a loud clack. She ended the session in a huff, declaring that the HOA would be issuing a temporary ban on all grilling activities pending further review. The crowd erupted into boos. Parents, elderly neighbors, even a group of young dads who'd just bought new smokers started pushing back. "What about birthdays? What about the 4th of July? Is she going to call SWAT if someone lights a birthday candle?" Later that afternoon, a flyer was dropped on every doorstep. In bold letters, it read, "Woodgrove Community Grill Ban, effective immediately. Violations may result in penalties." At the bottom was Karen's signature. That was all it took to set off a suburban uprising. Within hours, front lawns lit up, grills, smokers, hibachis. It was like a coordinated rebellion. The mom at the end of the street with 4 kids wheeled out a giant smoker she said had been sitting in the garage for years. "If they find me, they better be ready to fight in court. My brisket's worth it," she said. Even the usually silent neighbor across from Karen's house set up a portable fire pit and roasted marshmallows with his grandkids, all while blasting old Motown music. Karen came outside 3 times, each more dramatic than the last, shouting at people and snapping photos. No one took her seriously. At one point, someone handed her a hot dog just to mess with her. And of course, she called the police again. This time, though, the officers arrived, saw the situation, and decided not to even get out of the car. They rolled down the window and said, "Ma'am, unless there's a real fire or actual emergency, we suggest you stop misusing emergency services." Karen yelled something about toxic fumes and legal action, but the officers just shrugged and drove off. At that point, it was clear to everyone, Karen wasn't just out of control. She was spiraling, and people had stopped fearing her. They were laughing. And in a neighborhood like ours, laughter spreads like wildfire. That night, Dad and I sat on the porch, sipping iced tea, while the soft smell of hickory and sizzling meat floated through the air. "She's not going to let this go," I said. Dad nodded. "Nope. But she's about to make a mistake. And next time, she's not walking away with just embarrassment." He was right. Because by the time the next weekend rolled around, Karen's petty war would turn criminal. And she'd get caught red-handed. By the following Saturday, Karen's petty feud had escalated from laughable to dangerous. The community's grill rebellion had turned into a full-blown tradition overnight. People were setting up outdoor meals, neighbors were sharing recipes, and laughter echoed through the neighborhood like it hadn't in years. It was almost magical, but Karen saw none of it that way. Where we saw joy and connection, she saw disobedience and personal humiliation. And when someone like Karen feels embarrassed, they don't back down, they go scorched earth. She wasn't going to wait for another HOA meeting. No, she was going to make her next move in secret. The only problem was, she was the last person on earth who should be trying stealth. It started just before midnight. I was staying over at Dad's that night, helping him prep for the unofficial neighborhood barbecue potluck. He was rubbing spices into a rack of ribs while I prepped the coleslaw. We had music playing low, the porch lights on, and everything felt peaceful. Until the motion sensor near the side gate blinked on. Dad didn't even flinch. He calmly set the ribs down and said, "Check the monitor, will you?" I walked over to the little screen that displayed footage from his 4 security cameras. Sure enough, there was a figure in the shadows by the smoker. Hoodie, gloves, crouched low. And unmistakably female. "Is that Karen?" I whispered. The silhouette was clearly trying to disconnect something. She was yanking at the digital temperature control cable, which ran from the smoker into the wall outlet that powered the internal fan. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out what looked like a cheap lighter. My eyes widened. "She's not serious," I started, but Dad was already moving. He stepped outside calmly, no panic in his stride. I followed behind, phone in hand, camera recording. As we came around the corner of the house, Karen froze. Her hood was half off, revealing her unmistakable messy blonde bun. The cable dangled from her hand like a severed limb. A trail of ash led from the side of the smoker where she'd knocked over a drip tray and sent coals scattering. Thankfully, the smoker was built like a tank. No fire hazard, just a lot of smoke and a temporarily offline control system. Karen straightened up, trying to save face. "I was checking for a gas leak," she said, her voice shrill. "At midnight? In my yard?" Dad asked, stepping between her and the smoker. "With a lighter in your pocket?" I smelled something strange. "I thought maybe the unit was malfunctioning," she yelled. I was still recording. She didn't notice. Her adrenaline was so high she probably couldn't even feel the ground beneath her. Dad didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He just looked at her like she was a child caught lying about a broken lamp. "Karen, you just trespassed. You tampered with my property. And you put yourself and my house in danger. You're lucky the fire suppression fan kicked in automatically, or we'd have a real fire on our hands." Karen looked like she wanted to teleport. "This is ridiculous. You're making this bigger than it is." "No, Karen," he said. "You are. And now, we're going to let the professionals sort this out." He called the non-emergency police line and explained the situation. When the officer heard the name Harold Simmons, there was a long pause, followed by a very quick promise to send someone over. While we waited, Karen tried to leave, but Dad calmly asked her to stay put. "Unless you'd like me to include attempted fleeing in the report," he added. The responding officer arrived 15 minutes later, and took everything very seriously. Karen tried her best to twist the story, insisting she was investigating a community concern and had merely tripped near the equipment. But Dad's security footage was clear. It showed her entering without permission, yanking the cord, and panicking when the smoker emitted a puff of smoke from the tray she had knocked over. She had been holding the lighter the whole time. The officer reviewed the footage on the tablet and exhaled slowly. "Ma'am, this could qualify as criminal trespass and property tampering. Do you understand that?" Karen went pale. "I didn't know it was that serious." "I suggest you don't say anything else," the officer replied, then turned to Dad. "Would you like to press charges?" Dad looked at her for a long moment. "I'm not out for blood," he said. "But I am done being patient. Yes. File the report." Karen nearly fainted right there on the spot. The officer wrote up the complaint and gave her a formal citation with a court date. "You're lucky this didn't end in flames," he told her. You should know better. By the next morning, the entire neighborhood knew. Word spread like wildfire. Ironically, given the circumstances, neighbors who'd once feared Karen were now openly laughing at the situation. The mom down the block brought over cupcakes shaped like fire hydrants. Another neighbor printed out a screenshot from the security footage and turned it into a fake wanted poster. Caution: grill tampering Karen on the loose. The HOA board was forced to meet again, but this time without Karen presiding. She'd been temporarily suspended pending the outcome of her court case. Frank tried to defend her in her absence, but was shouted down by half the room. People had had enough. Dad, meanwhile, received a phone call from the county fire department. The chief himself wanted to thank him for not overreacting and for continuing to serve as an example of professionalism. They also asked if he'd be willing to join the advisory board again, just in a part-time role. Dad chuckled and said he'd consider it, as long as it didn't interfere with his weekend brisket schedule. I posted a clip from the backyard incident, just the part where Karen tries to bluff about the gas leak and Dad calmly shuts her down. Within a few hours, it was climbing Reddit's r/entitled people. The caption read, "Karen tampered with my dad's grill at midnight, didn't know he's the fire marshal." Comments poured in. People couldn't believe her nerve. Some thought it was staged because it was too perfect. Others turned it into memes. One person dubbed the footage with dramatic music and posted it as the Great Smoke Showdown. Karen, meanwhile, went completely quiet. She stopped showing her face around the neighborhood. Her porch lights stayed off. Her car was parked several streets over to avoid the embarrassment of being seen. But it was too late. The damage to her pride had been done. And while the community laughed and cheered and grilled even harder, one thing became clear. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Karen had been wounded, humiliated, even cited. And when people like her feel cornered, they don't surrender. They scheme. I could feel it. Something bigger was coming. And the next time, it wouldn't just be about grilling. It would be a full-blown HOA meltdown. But if she thought she could outplay a man who spent 30 years extinguishing fires and handling high-stakes emergencies, she was in for the shock of her life. Because my dad wasn't just going to roast ribs. He was about to roast the entire HOA. The silence after Karen's midnight stunt didn't last long. Just as predicted, she couldn't stay buried in her embarrassment for more than a few days before the rage began to bubble again. She went quiet for exactly 3 mornings. Then on the 4th, the HOA bulletin board had a new notice, stapled crookedly and printed in all caps. Emergency Fire Safety Enforcement Committee to be formed. All grilling, smoking, and open-flame cooking equipment to be removed from public view immediately. Fines will be issued. No exceptions. It was signed, of course, by Karen, who had not only reinstated herself as president without board approval but added a footnote. Special inspection rounds will begin this weekend. My dad read the notice and snorted. Oh, so now she's gone full rogue. He was right. Karen was past the point of saving face. She wanted revenge, structure be damned. Despite the absurdity of it, people were rattled. The previous fun of the neighborhood BBQs was being overshadowed by sudden threats of fines and unannounced inspections. One elderly neighbor told us she received a warning for having an unsanctioned garden torch. Another was fined for a citronella candle. Karen was clearly going door to door, clipboard in hand, snapping photos and leaving warning slips like she was playing some twisted version of HOA Monopoly. But she didn't realize that her authority had officially expired the moment she trespassed and earned a court date. That's when the real tide began to turn. Unbeknownst to Karen, my dad had been quietly collecting statements from neighbors. Every ridiculous fine, every bogus threat, every forged letter, he documented them all. Several residents emailed him with copies of Karen's emergency enforcement letters, none of which had the proper HOA stamp or backing board signatures. Frank tried defending the actions during a rushed board meeting, claiming that safety doesn't need permission, but no one bought it anymore. Especially not after one neighbor revealed Karen had tried to peer into her backyard windows under the excuse of a flame check. With all this building pressure, my dad made a move no one expected. He filed for a formal injunction with the county housing department. The basis was simple: misuse of HOA power, repeated community harassment, and fraudulent leadership actions post-suspension. The evidence? Rock solid. Karen had violated her suspension, issued illegal fines, and misrepresented her position in official document. The housing office took it seriously. Within days, they scheduled an administrative review hearing. Karen, of course, was livid when she found out. She tried spinning it as a targeted campaign against her safety initiatives, but the community wasn't buying it. While the legal process was underway, my dad doubled down on public unity. He organized a community fire safety awareness cookout, sponsored, not by the HOA, but by the local fire department. He reached out to his old colleagues, and they were more than happy to support the event. They even brought a mobile fire safety unit, handed out educational materials, and provided grilling demos for families. It was the biggest neighborhood turnout in years. Kids played games, adults shared recipes, and nobody mentioned Karen's name except in joke. But the most stunning moment came just as the mayor's office arrived. My dad had quietly invited the mayor herself, a longtime acquaintance from his days training city emergency response teams. She showed up wearing sunglasses, shook hands with everyone, and gave a brief speech about community values, neighborhood trust, and recognizing the difference between safety and harassment. She never mentioned Karen by name, but the message was crystal clear. Karen stood across the street, arms crossed, staring at the crowd like she was watching her kingdom burn. She tried to approach, clipboard in hand, but two city officials politely turned her away, reminding her that pending the hearing, she had no enforcement authority of any kind. She went red, turned on her heel, and stormed off down the sidewalk while someone from the grill station called out, "Hey Karen, want a hot dog?" Laughter rippled across the crowd. The day after the cookout, Karen received the formal notice. Her actions were under investigation, and her role in the HOA was officially suspended pending the outcome. She responded the only way she knew how. She doubled down again. She tried to call for an emergency vote to dissolve the current HOA leadership entirely and reinstate herself as president. But only two people showed up to her impromptu meeting: Frank and a confused teenager who thought it was a garage sale. That attempt fizzled out instantly. Then came the review hearing, held at the city municipal building. My dad attended with a stack of evidence and half a dozen neighbors who volunteered to testify. Karen showed up in a blazer 2 sizes too big, carrying a massive binder labeled "Hazards of Irresponsible Grilling." She rambled for 20 minutes about health risks, fire dangers, and smoke terrorism, a phrase that made the reviewing officer raise his eyebrows and take a long, slow sip from his water bottle. My dad, on the other hand, presented calmly, laying out a timeline of harassment, the trespassing incident, the illegal fines, and the unauthorized letters. Then came the footage. The same clip I had posted online of Karen sneaking around his backyard and tampering with the smoker. The moment the footage played, the room went silent. Karen tried to object, but it was too late. The hearing concluded shortly after. The panel announced that Karen's behavior had not only violated community trust but also breached municipal codes regarding personal conduct in leadership positions. She was formally removed from the HOA board and barred from holding any position of authority in the community for a minimum of 5 years. Frank was warned that further enabling behavior would result in his removal too. It was over. Karen had officially fallen from her self-proclaimed throne. Word spread before we even left the building. When we got back to the neighborhood, someone had already replaced the HOA bulletin board with a large paper sign that read, "Now serving justice, with a side of ribs." And in bold marker underneath, "Thank you, Fire Marshal Simmons." Karen disappeared again after that. She wasn't seen for days. Her porch stayed dark, her windows shut. She had become a ghost in the very neighborhood she once ruled with passive-aggressive post-it notes and emailed threat. Meanwhile, the community blossomed. The new acting HOA president, Marcia, opened every meeting with, "No bans, just boundaries," and introduced a fair, transparent voting system. And most importantly, grilling was not only allowed but celebrated. My dad? He finally agreed to join the County Fire Advisory Board again, just one weekend a month. When I asked him why, he said, "Some fires start with sparks. Some start with bad leadership. Either way, I'm just here to make sure they don't burn the whole place down." As for Karen, we thought she'd finally learned her lesson. But the woman was nothing if not persistent. And even from the shadows, she was planning one final stunt. We just didn't know yet how far she was willing to go, or how badly it would backfire. We should have known Karen wasn't done. Even after the injunction, the community support collapse, and her official HOA expulsion, there was this lingering sense that she wasn't going to fade out quietly. Karen wasn't the type to accept defeat, even when it was gift-wrapped with unanimous votes, city rulings, and half the neighborhood clapping as she walked away. For most people, that would have been a wake-up call. For Karen, it was merely a setback. And sure enough, a few weeks later, her curtain call came, but it didn't just fizzle out. It exploded like a firecracker dropped into a bucket of gasoline. The first clue was a strange flyer that appeared on community doors one Thursday morning. It was printed in glossy colors and designed like a cheap magazine ad, promising a neighborhood revival picnic, hosted by a group calling themselves the Concerned Citizens for Safe Suburban Living. The contact email was suspiciously familiar, and the list of new safety regulations, printed on the back, included a ban on charcoal grills, outdoor cooking spices, firewood stacking, and scented candles over 4 ounces. Karen had found a loophole. She wasn't coming back through the HOA. She was trying to build a shadow organization to regain control. At first, no one took it seriously. People laughed it off and shared photos of the flyer online with sarcastic captions like, "Is my vanilla candle a fire risk now?" and "Somebody's still salty." But by the weekend, a few of the less involved residents, folks who hadn't followed the saga closely, started asking questions. They'd received emails that seemed official, urging them to attend the event and vote on new safety initiatives. Karen was trying to rebrand her obsession as community activism. Dad immediately recognized what she was doing. "She's trying to use community events to make herself relevant again," he said. Classic pivot. He wasn't angry. He was impressed in a disappointed way, like a teacher watching a student fail the same test over and over but with more creative spelling errors each time. Still, he wasn't about to let her get away with it. So he made a few calls, reached out to the new HOA president, and quietly coordinated a counterplan. The day of the so-called neighborhood revival picnic arrived, and to Karen's surprise, a modest crowd actually showed up. Not out of support, but out of curiosity. She had a little tent set up in the park, a sad-looking table covered with laminated, safety materials, and a megaphone she used to announce that community unity begins with shared rules. But she didn't know what was coming. Half an hour into her speech, a second, much larger group entered the park. Dad led the charge, wearing his grilling apron and pushing a massive rolling smoker covered with a banner that read "Flame and Justice, Fire Safety Cookout." Behind him came the fire department's community outreach team, the new HOA board, and what looked like every neighbor with a grill, portable oven, or open flame appliance they could legally operate outdoors. It was an invasion of flavor, and it swallowed Karen's picnic whole. People flooded the space, setting up tables and chairs, sharing food, and laughing like old friends. The fire department handed out free safety booklets and firefighter hats for kids. The HOA handed out "Grill and Chill" stickers. Someone brought a karaoke machine, and a crowd formed around a dad singing "Burning Down the House" with surprising accuracy. Karen was livid. She paced around her tent, trying to shout over the crowd, but no one listened. Her laminated flyers were used as makeshift plates. Her tent sagged in the wind, unattended. Still, she tried one last move. She walked right up to Dad, flanked by 2 confused supporters, and announced, "You're violating city gathering codes. This is an unsanctioned event." Dad didn't flinch. He pointed toward the smiling mayor, who had just arrived with her security detail, and said, "Tell her that. She's the one who approved the permit." Karen turned, saw the mayor shaking hands and eating cornbread, and her face went white. Her supporters quietly walked away. Then came the final blow. As Karen stood frozen, a local news crew walked over. They had come to report on the community event after seeing social media posts. They'd heard it was organized by a retired fire marshal and wanted to interview him. Dad stepped into frame, gracious as ever, and told the full story about responsible grilling, community resilience, and how good food brought people together in the face of absurd rules. The reporter asked about the controversy with the HOA. Dad smiled and said, "Sometimes, the people who scream the loudest about rules are the first ones to break them when things don't go their way." Karen was standing 10 feet away when the camera cut to her. The reporter turned and asked, "Ma'am, would you like to comment?" She opened her mouth, then closed it. A slow shake of the head, and she walked away without saying a word. That clip aired on the local news that night. It went viral the next morning. And for the second time in a month, Karen's name was trending, for all the wrong reasons. She sold her house 2 weeks later. No big announcement, no goodbye, no last attempt at sabotage. Just a for sale sign hammered into the front lawn, and a moving truck that came before dawn. The neighborhood watched from behind curtains and porches. When the truck drove off, someone played "Another One Bites the Dust" on their speaker. People clapped. It felt like the credits were rolling. With Karen gone, life in the neighborhood bloomed. The HOA returned to common-sense policies, led by a team that actually listened. Monthly grill nights became a tradition. Dad's online grilling page took off, filled with stories, safety tips, and photos of his latest ribs. The community finally felt like a community again, united not by conflict, but by shared experiences, a little smoke, and a lot of flavor. Looking back, I realized something funny. All Karen ever wanted was control. But by trying to force everyone to follow her narrow idea of order, she ended up proving why she should never have had it in the first place. In contrast, Dad never tried to control anyone. He led with quiet wisdom, respect, and a steady hand. And in the end, it wasn't his badge or his title that won. It was his calm in the heat, both literal and metaphorical. As we stood on the porch one evening, another grill night winding down, I asked him how he always stayed so composed. He took a sip of iced tea, looked out at the neighbors laughing around a fire pit, and said, "You can't put out every spark, but you can choose what kind of flame you want to spread." I smiled. Karen had spread fear. He'd spread community. And this time, the right fire had won.